بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Sorry for the delay today. My webcam stopped working, so I've got it up and running again. Alhamdulillah. So today's session, and it will stretch over to hopefully next week. So it'll be a two-parter, like we did on the Devil in the Detail. And this particular discourse will be on a very special story in the Quran, and I want to look at a particular dimension of that story itself, and want to give possibly a different take to what's normally discussed or what's normally understood from that story. Now, I want to begin with the title itself, and some background to the story and kind of the characters of people in the story. Now, the title is Where the Two Seas Meet, a play on the actual verse of the Quran, Majma al-Bahraini, where these two people will meet, these two notable people in the Quran, and that's why the title is why this discourse is titled as where the two seas meet. I want to give a bit of background to this story in the Quran. There's a surah in the Quran, a chapter known as Surah al-Kahf. Kahf is a name, and this sometimes happens with the Quran, where a surah may be named based on a particular moment or a particular sub-story within the surah itself. It's in Arabic is known as Tasmiyatul Kul bil Juz, where you name an entire thing, and books are often named like that, where they'll name a book based on a chapter. One of the chapters will be the book title, and in this case, Surah Al-Kahf is named in that way. The word Kahf in the Quran is normally translated as the surah of the cave, or however, the word Kahf is a disputed. The meaning of it is disputed and is differed upon. But one of the main stories in that chapter of the Quran is the story of the sleepers, the young men, and that's not a topic, and it seems that the surah has been known or named because of it, due to that story. Our story, however, the story that I want to talk about is the relationship, the meeting, and the inner meanings of the journey between the Prophet Moses, Musa alayhi salam, and this mystical figure, al-Khadir. And today, inshallah, I want to take a bit of time talking about al-Khadir and some of the kind of ideas behind the story itself, and him especially, and the kind of mystic dimension of our heritage and of our tradition. So I want to begin with an introduction to these two people and this kind of idea of spiritual guidance within this surah. Now, I want to begin with Musa alayhi salam first, and then bring in al-Khadir, inshallah. Now, like I said, it'll be over 2 weeks, so next week I'll be discussing more in detail the verses and deriving from them kind of spiritual lessons. Musa alayhi salam, as you know, is considered to be one of the mightiest prophets after the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam, and in fact he's the most mentioned prophet in the Quran, Musa alayhi salam. Now, his name, of course, in Arabic, Arabized version of his name is Musa, in English referred to as Moses, neither of which are his actual name, considering that names in Arabic, of course, have been changed slightly for ease of pronunciation within that language itself, similar to the word Moses. So his name, these are kind of almost how different cultures would have pronounced his name. He is described in the hadith literature. He's not described much in the Quran. In the Quran about Musa alayhi salam, you only know about him through kind of his experiences. But he is described by the Prophet ﷺ as being a man that was very strong, physically strong, but also his kind of outstanding characteristic, or something that was kind of very obvious about him, was the fact that his level of justice was always evident. The fact that he would always talking about justice and administering justice in that sense. His description seems to be that he was quite dark-skinned, and he resembled the Prophet ﷺ said some of the men from a particular tribe in Yemen, of Shanu'a. He, in one narration, actually mentions that he had a lot of hair on his chest, such that if he wore two shirts, you could still see the fact that he had a lot of hair on his chest. And he was golden complexion. I mean, very dark skinned. I know some people have commented that Moses was black, in the sense of how we consider the color black now in terms of a person's color. But that's, I think, a valid interpretation in that context. One of the problems we have as Muslims, unfortunately, and especially being from, if you're from the Arab world or the subcontinent, is that blackness, in a sense, of somebody's color, is seen, unfortunately, they still have kind of racist traits in them, where if somebody were to say that, oh, Adam alayhi salam, which is quite clear that he was black, they would kind of roll their eyes a little bit like, what do you mean? And that's a hidden form of racism within people, to assume that we didn't have many black prophets, which we did. Of course, it wouldn't make any sense otherwise. And it seems that all kind of anthropological and kind of all the historical evidences we have infer quite clearly that Adam, also saying that Adam's name is Adam, meaning the color of earth, was black, that the first man was black. But my point is not that. My underlying point is that we still have this problem amongst our community, our attitude, especially amongst, like I said, from the subcontinent and from the Turks as well, by the way, and the Arab world, that blackness is somehow something negative and something bad, and which is really bad, something that we must wipe away these notions. So it's very possible that Musa alayhi salam fits that description, that context. We don't know really, but certain things allude to it. Now, the other person in the story, there are two other people. There's Yusha bin Nun and there's al-Khadir. And I want to introduce both. And today will be a character introduction and introduction to the spiritual dimension of the surah, that particular story. Musa alayhi salam's companion, his name is Yusha bin Nun. Now, he's mentioned in the Bible, Joshua, in Deuteronomy and other books, and he seems to have been responsible, at least because Moses' burial is discussed in Deuteronomy, and the only person who could narrate that story was Yusha bin Nun, Joshua. Now, he seems to be quite young, because he's referred to in the surah as Fata. And a Fata is a young person, so possibly a teenager. So in this surah, he is referred to as an apprentice of Moses. And there is a subtlety in the wording that God uses, the words that are used in the surah, in reference to that further proves that he was a disciple and that was very young. And there's even a spiritual lesson in that. Now, the third person, and he undertakes his journey with Moses. The third person in the story is al-Khadir. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about al-Khadir and this historical figure, who he was, and why he's quite important. I had previously written quite a bit about al-Khadir, and I don't want to, some people may have attended those lectures, so I don't want to give too much away and talk about al-Khadir too much, but I do want to introduce him. Now, al-Khadir is almost a completely unknown quantity when it comes to the Quran. Unknown person, sorry. Why? Because God never mentions his name, never tells you anything about him besides a few little details. He refers to him as Abdun min ibadina. He was a servant from our servants, the ones who serve God, meaning in that sense. And he refers to him as a mercy, a rahmah. We have al-Khadir seemingly come up in other traditions. In the Jewish tradition, there is some mention of Khadir possibly being Elijah. And there are some stories that you find some similarities with the story of Moses and Khadir, with some of the stories mentioned by some of the Jewish authors. Although there's nothing clear there. Is he Elijah? The kind of Elijah is the person who is the saintly figure, kind of the protector of the travelers. Who knows? Allah knows best. But definitely and most certainly we will find al-Khadir in other traditions. Some argue have argued that Khadir is actually Buddha. Now, we can't confirm or deny any of these points in absolute terms, that the story of Buddha kind of fits perfectly with the story of Khadir, the son of a king, or a king himself leaving his kingdom. And there are some, and I'm going to mention some of those stories. In hadith literature, and that's what we can possibly rely upon, we only have a few things, because we can only certify things that have been mentioned, or could definitely say this is true, if the Prophet himself told us about al-Khadir. Now, we know about his name. The Prophet ﷺ in a hadith narrated by Imam al-Bukhari actually talks about al-Khadir, and that the Messenger of God ﷺ talks about the beginning of this story, and we're going to mention that in a short while. But also there's a hadith that talks about why he is called al-Khadir. Now, the word Khadir in the Quran, in Arabic, refers to something that's green, like al-khadrawat, for instance, like vegetables, or anything that's khadra is green. Now, some say that, or the hadith suggests, that narration suggests that he went somewhere and he sat in that place or remained in that place, and that place became green. We don't know the context of what that may mean, but it seems that his name is associated with this color green. So we have these mythical kind of ideas of, that Khadir is the green man, the man who wears a green cloak. So you'll see some depictions of Khadir in Persian literature and in Turkish literature as wearing a green robe or a green turban. And some of the Sufi traditions took from the idea of wearing of green. Bear in mind that they were not taking their tradition from the color of the green dome. Doesn't seem so, because the color of the dome, the dome that is above the blessed grave of the Prophet ﷺ, wasn't green. It's a kind of, was introduced quite some hundreds of years ago. The color of that dome prior was, I think, like a bluey, purpley color. I don't know what color between blue and purple. We could have something like an aubergine type of color. So, and then it was changed to green. So it's not the significance of the color of the dome that seems to be the representation of those. It's possible that representation within some of these spiritual orders was related to al-Khadir. I know some, I've read some were definitely, others I don't know. Maybe. So also the Prophet ﷺ did love the color green as well. It could be that, but Khadir definitely has a place. So I want to talk about that a little now. His name, of course, is unknown. There's some speculation about his name, but obviously he would not have an Arabic name, considering he's not an Arab. But he would have a Suryani name, or from the early languages. But his name is unknown. He's known as al-Khadir. In the Persian tradition, Khizr, in Urdu tradition, Khizr, Khwaja Khizr sometimes. But in Arabic, al-Khadir or al-Khidr, both are valid kind of ways that they refer to him as. Of course, like I said, that's not his actual name. Now, in the spiritual tradition, in our spiritual tradition, we have many discussions about al-Khadir. In fact, Khadir does survive in only the spiritual tradition. In the Sufi tradition, and that is kind of we're talking from Abul Qasim al-Kushairi all the way to Abdul Qadir al-Gilani, rahimahullah ta'ala, to the later kind of Ibn Ajibas and the Darqawis and people of that kind, even Nawawi, and I'll get to Nawawi in a short while. It seems to be a kind of a silent kind of ijma, consensus, that al-Khadir, this person, is still alive. However, this has been disputed, of course, by other scholars who believe that he had passed away. This is not a matter of religion, of course. This is a matter of, it doesn't fall into the domain of religion in that sense, if he's alive or not. That's not a religious debate. But the Sufi tradition, the spiritual tradition of these kind of people, Abdul Qadir al-Gilani, al-Jili, people like Abul Qasim al-Kushairi, people like later people like Ibn Ajiba and other people like Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Tirmidhi, and a famous Persian a scholar from Shiraz, uh, uh, Ruzbihan, and people like that. They all believed he was alive, seemingly. Now, this does ask quite a few, kind of beg a few questions, at least. How is a man who existed thousands of years ago, how can he still be alive now? In fact, they argue from that perspective that not only was he alive, that he attended the funeral of the Prophet ﷺ, and things of that nature. Now, they are quite certain about he's living. Well, the fact that he's alive. Some of them try to explain it. Ibn Arabi, for instance, the Andalusian Sufi, not only believed he was alive, but documented his meetings with him, where he met him and when he was traveling on a boat. But interestingly enough, if one argues that, okay, that's the Sufi tradition in that sense. Even the people of the Hadith tradition, like An-Nawawi, Abu Zakaria, a very famous Hadith scholar, and seen as an absolute traditionalist, also seemingly believed that he was alive and mentioned meeting him. So that's interesting as well, that you also have mention of him living in other traditions. Now, if we were to argue that he is alive, we have to then discuss to a degree who he is. Who is this man? And this has been the center of a debate as well amongst scholars and the people of knowledge. And there have been certain things that have been said about it. Most accept the fact that he was a human being. There is an opinion that he was an angel, that he is not a human being and he is an angel. That opinion hasn't received much acceptance, given much credit in amongst scholars or the circles of knowledge. But it was out there that he was, some suggested that he may be an angel. Most of them accepted him to be a bashar, a human being. And then there's a difference of, okay, then what position or rank does he hold? Does he hold a saintly rank, or does he hold a rank of prophethood? Imam al-Razi, the famous exegete and theologian, philosopher, argued that he is not a prophet. And gave various reasons why he didn't believe he was a prophet. However, another traditionalist, scholar of Hadith, Ibn Kathir, if my memory serves me correctly, believed he was a prophet. Now, you may say that what does that matter if he is a prophet, or if it doesn't really in truth. However, it does change the narrative of the Quran when one can see it from a different perspective if he's a prophet, and a slightly different perspective if he is a saint. That's the only kind of maybe. Subki stated that, rahimullah ta'ala, that there's no clear one way or another. It doesn't really, nobody really knows if he is either. However, but that doesn't still answer the question of him being alive. People have a lifespan. Everybody has a lifespan. And we do not know of long lifespans really in our tradition, in that sense. 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000. This is a serious number. Some say that Khadir has been alive since the time of Abraham, which would be like 5,000 years plus. Now, if we, however, have another understanding, it depends, because it's open to discussion. If we believe that existence itself, wujud, has different realms in a sense. I mean, you could take the string theory if you want, and the 11 possible different dimensions in discussions of the string theory, that although we observe a particular dimension, but there can be multiple dimensions, and you can go and read up on the string theory. And I know this, don't get me wrong, don't stop putting me on blast about, but the string theory is not established. It has a lot of holes in it, and as many questions it attempts to answer, the more questions are asked about it. And there's no real proof for it at the moment. They're only discussions. I accept that. But there are these discussions amongst scientists now and leading theoretical physicists about the fact that the more we look at the universe, the more detail that we see, the more questions that come up. And the more we realize that we know very little about the universe and of existence itself, very little, in fact. Occam's razor now is not working much anymore, because the simple answer, the easiest answer, seemingly is not answering the question at all. It's becoming more detailed and more confusing. However, we already as believers believe in multiple dimensions of existence. Take the idea of jinn. Jinn, the word Jannah, the verb, not the noun referring to heaven. Jannah without the ta marbuta, I mean, means something that's unseen to the human eye. So the jinn in the Quran are called a jinn because you can't see them. They exist possibly in a dimension that is not visible to within our kind of perception, or our line of vision. We just can't see them. Now, this could be another possibility, that these dimensions exist side by side, and we just can't see them or have access to them. And does Khadir live or exist on one of those planes in one of those dimensions, such that he avails himself to who he chooses, and he has always possibly existed within that dimension? This is a possible solution that has been argued by some of the Sufis, actually, and now it has been argued by some other people, that we know very little about existence itself, that our only experience of existence is ourselves and what we can observe. But beyond that, more information that we're gathering and data, it's quite clear that we have very little knowledge of existence. That is a possibility, I would say. An-Nawawi claims he met him. I mean, and that's interesting, because normally you have these people who just discredit this idea about him being alive by saying, look, these are just kind of supernatural, made up stories of people's subjective experiences. And it's the same type of people, these esoteric or these kind of very spiritually minded people. When you get a hadith scholar, and he's not the only one, by the way, a scholar who is normally kind of engrossed in just hadith and Shafi fiqh and things like that, it seems a bit odd. So is he alive? I mean, I'm not here to answer that question today now, but he definitely was alive in the time of Moses. And when we get into the story, we'll realize very quickly how he becomes even more mystical in that sense. Now we want to get to the story, and I'll open that up a little bit. Like I said, from next week, I'm going to be talking about up to 10 spiritual lessons from that story that we can actually practically take away and apply in our lives as well. I want to get to the beginning of the story itself. Now, the beginning is not mentioned in the Quran at all. The story starts in the Quran where Allah says, وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِفَتَاهُ لَا أَبْرَحُ حَتَّى أَبْلُغَ مَجْمَعَ الْبَحْرَيْنِ أَوْ أَمْضِيَ حُقُوبًا. Musa alayhi salam says to his disciple Joshua, he says, Allah says, when Moses said to his young attendant, I will not give up journeying until I reach the junction of the two seas. This whole idea, the meeting of the two seas, though I may march on for ages, for eons. Now, this wording that Allah uses in the Quran, Majma' al-Bahraini, some of the tafsir ishari, the tafsirs, the commentaries on the Quran that are more spiritual, that are more subtle, say actually the meeting of the two seas is not a place. Or in addition to the place, the meeting of the two seas are Musa and al-Khadir. These are the two mighty seas of ma'rifah, of God knowledge, God consciousness, that are coming together. And that's what the true reference of this wording is, Majma' al-Bahrain. Now, of course, it does have that meaning as well. There's no doubt that Musa alayhi salam is Bahrul Ma'rifah in that sense, and so is al-Khadir. Now, we only know of the beginning of this story in a hadith narrated by the Messenger of God, narrated in al-Bukhari, where the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam talks about Musa alayhi salam sitting or standing, talking or teaching Bani Israel, some of the children of Israel. And a question is asked, or they ask him a question. I'll read the narration to you. Abdullah ibn Abbas narrates this this hadith, and that he was standing And Musa alayhi salam, he was asked about by the people who is the most knowledgeable. And he replied, I am the most knowledgeable, seemingly because he's the mightiest prophet of that time. And God then replied and said uh, to him not to attribute this idea of absolute knowledge to himself. So God said to him, I have a servant, an abd, at the meeting of the two seas who is more learned than you. Now we're going to get to that and unpack what that means later. The Prophet Musa said, Oh my Lord, how can I meet him? God said, take a fish and put it in a large basket and you will find him at the place where you lose your fish. Now, that seems an ishara, a sign that God sends to his prophets of certain things will take place when will manifest at certain points that God gives. And we have many examples of this in the life of the Prophet ﷺ that happen in that way. So the story begins and Musa alayhi salam begins his journey. I want to bring al-Khadir here a little bit and talk about some of the historical points related to al-Khadir and then get to the themes of the surah and start to unpack one of them inshallah today. And that is that in the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'd, there's a story about Musa alayhi salam. It's about Khadir. It's a long story. And it's about him being a young man in the time of Moses, older than Musa alayhi salam, however. And it's linked to the story of Pharaoh and the house of Pharaoh and how Khadir actually would put Khadir in that region, that he was actually in the same region as Musa alayhi salam. However, although that story, there's a question about its strength, in other traditions, it places al-Khadir somewhere else. Some of the traditions suggest he was more in the Far East, Some suggest that he was actually in around Turkey, which still puts him quite a distance away. Now, al-Khadir in these traditions, in one tradition, for instance, he comes to Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, if that's the case, now he's much older. He must have been living for a very long time. And he meets Abraham and he makes tawaf of the Kaaba with Ibrahim alayhi salam. Even more, there are some suggestions that he was in the army of Dhul Qarnayn. Now, this is really now becoming scattered in terms of narrations, that this is a man that's seemingly serving every generation in the time of Dhul Qarnayn, but then Dhul Qarnayn, according to some, is in the time of Abraham. So that would put them together in some way. And Dhul Qarnayn actually visited Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was in Mecca. Allah knows best. These are like historical points that have never been proven. It's possible, of course. Now, Khadir, in all of these narrations, seems to have a similar task. What he does is, he goes to a community and he preaches to the community or spiritually enlightens a community, and then he moves on. And then he visits certain people, and then he trains them or gives them information that they can't normally get. And he keeps popping up in history in these different places to give this spiritual education, al-Khadir, to chosen people chosen by God. And then he just disappears. And this is the way that Khadir always seemingly operates. So in this story, it's almost exactly the same. Musa alayhi salam now asks God who this man is, and God says, look, you can find him, but you will only find him here. And he sets off. Now, this is interesting that Musa alayhi salam, and this is the first lesson that we learn, a lesson of spirituality is a lesson of endeavor, the lesson of perseverance. That perseverance is the central characteristic, one of the greatest characteristics of the spiritual seeker, perseverance. Musa alayhi salam says in this verse, La abrahu hatta abluga majma' al-bahrain aw amdiya huquba. He says that I will not rest until I reach this place, aw amdiya huquba, even if I end up spending eons looking for him, I'm not going to stop. That was his certainty in wanting to meet him. Now, this is the first lesson or spiritual lesson or theme, it seems, in this story is Musa alayhi salam's perseverance. Many of the Sufi commentaries, like Kushairi, for instance, Abul Qasim, mention that, and I'm going to get to the tutor student in a second, mention that this is essentially the first lesson that we learn, that for the spiritual student, what they call the murid, the one who wishes or seeks God, wishes for God, It's perseverance, that if he thinks that he's going to read something, pray a little, and he will have spiritual experience. This is not the case at all. In fact, Imam Alawi mentions that if you find a man, interestingly, that's performing miracles, he said, run away from him. Why? Because he says that that's not how we test somebody's relationship with God. Run away from him and observe him from a distance if he follows the rules that God has laid out in his religion. So that's quite important. So the first point is perseverance and breaking that idea. Now, is the story of Musa alayhi salam and al-Khadir a tutor-student story? Well, according to Ibn Arabi, and this is quite interesting as well, he does not see it as a story of tutor-student. Why? And we're going to learn about the story later, but the reason he says, well, we can argue is because if we argue that it's a tutor-student relationship, what does that do to the rank of each person? Moses is quite clearly in the Quran he has a mightier rank and a higher station than al-Khadir, quite clearly. He's from Ulul Azm, he's from the greatest of prophets, he has the greatest of ranks, and al-Khadir is unknown in that sense. He's not known to be a prophet, or not with certainty a prophet, or just a great man of God. So how is it that now we have a tutor-student, but it's in reverse daraja? It's in that Khadir's rank is lower than that of Musa alayhi salam. Allah says in the Quran that some of them we've preferred over others. So how is that? So it could be that Ibn Arabi was referring to that. Others, however, Abu Qasim al-Kushairi and others quite clearly argue it from a tutor-student perspective or disciple. But what they mean by that is not that Moses is now the disciple of al-Khadir. They mean that what can be derived from that story is tutor-disciple lessons, not that he in absolute terms was. And therefore, some of them say that at the end of the story, when they depart, they don't depart because al-Khadir leaves Moses. It was a mutual separation. They both agree, and we can see that in the verse. Now Musa alayhi salam says, look, it's time to go. I have received what I needed. And al-Khadir leaves. That's his normal natural habit, that he never stays around and he then disappears. We never hear of al-Khadir again. In fact, there is no mention in the Quran, and as far as I'm aware, in the Sunnah of Khadir again, aside from that incident. The Sunnah does mention there are hadith which are weak, the way he attends apparently the janazah of the Prophet ﷺ, and Sayyidina Umar points him out, but I don't think there's any authenticity to that narration. Now, here's another interesting point, that Yusha bin Nun, and this is the next lesson, you could call it. Imam Sunusi talks about knowledge, and he talks about knowledge of prophets. And he says that knowledge of prophets is of three types. The first type is the knowledge of prophets that they give to everybody, and they're ordered to give that knowledge. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ, that give to them, like proclaim or preach that which, the knowledge which you have been given. بَلِّغ, Allah says. Now, that's a knowledge we have today. Then he says the second type of knowledge that the Prophets have is a knowledge that they only give to the khawas, specific people. What's the proof of that? The proof of that is the narration of Hudhayfa ibn Yaman, when he goes to the Messenger of God, and the Messenger of God gives him the knowledge of the hypocrites in Medina. And he gives it to nobody else. He does not give it to anybody else, rather. He gives it to Hudhayfa bin Yaman. Even Sayyidina Umar did not know their names. Furthermore, we know the hadith of Abu Hurairah about the two sacks of knowledge. Furthermore, we know of the narration of Sayyidina Ali, where clearly the Prophet ﷺ was giving specific knowledge to specific people that was not shared amongst the companions, categorically. What was the purpose of that knowledge? Well, there's for instance, the narration of Abu Hurairah that if I were to give you that knowledge, you would kill me, meaning you would sever my head or cut my throat. Some say that that knowledge could refer to the fact of end of time prophecies that were taking place at that time with the names of certain people. They say it could be that was quite dangerous. And others say they were related, the more spiritually inclined scholars and people of Zuhud say they were secrets that were related to haqiqah and ma'rifah, to God, and that a normal person couldn't compute or understand these kind of subtleties about Allah Jalla wa'ala. Maybe, Allah knows best. And the third type of knowledge was the knowledge that he did not give to anybody, it was only for him. And proof of that is the ulama argue that the huruf muqatta'at in the Quran, the cryptic letters in the Quran, alif, lam, mim, ha, mim, yasin, taha, nun, these letters that nobody has really the knowledge of, that the knowledge of that was given to the Prophet ﷺ. And the argument is, as Ulusi mentions, that if the prophets didn't know that, then the Jews of Medina and other people would have claimed that God reveals a book to his prophet that he himself does not understand. And further proof is the fact that Abdullah ibn Abbas and other companions attempted to decrypt those letters. They attempted to decrypt those letters to give the meaning of what, for instance, Yasin, according to some, is a name of the Prophet ﷺ. Innaka lamin al-mursaleen, because the next statement is a confirmation of that. And alif, lam, mim, these are letters that have this kind of subtle meanings and special meanings. So that's possible, but also the Prophet ﷺ said that I am the most knowledgeable of God, and clearly he didn't give us a lot of that knowledge. Now, the reason I mention that is because of the next part of the story. Let me just get to it. So, in the next part of the story, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَجْمَعَ بَيْنِهِمَا نَسِيَ حُوتَهُمَا فَاتَّخَذَ سَبِيلَهُ فِي الْبَحْرِ سَرَبًا. So the story continues, and I'm going to comment on this next week, but the story continues with just the two parties. Those two parties being Moses and Yusha bin Nun. Musa alayhi salam and Yusha, or Moses and Joshua alayhi salam. But when we get to the point where Musa alayhi salam meets Khadir, the verb changes. Now, it says, فَانْطَلَقَ حَتَّى إِذَا رَكِبَ فِي السَّفِينَةِ. Now, originally there are two people in the story. But when we get to Musa alayhi salam, Sayyidina Musa meeting al-Khadir, interestingly, the verb does not change. The verb, because in the Arabic language, of course, unlike the English language, we have a verb that represents a singular person and a single person, and we have a verb that represents more than two, and we have a verb that represents a dual, two people. So you will know that that particular verb is referring to only two people. But yet the verb stays dual throughout the surah. The inference is quite clear that Yusha bin Nun has been removed from the journey. Now, this is a subtlety in the Quran but it has a spiritual lesson with it as well. That it seems that Yusha bin Nun, being so young, was not to be included in the unveiling or the receiving of this particular knowledge from al-Khadir. Why? Because he was too young. He was untrained for that, to receive that particular knowledge. So Musa alayhi salam seemingly leaves him behind. And he's not mentioned in the story again. He is almost removed entirely. And the story continues with only Musa alayhi salam and al-Khadir. So one of the lessons we learn for that is the idea that youth, being young, the certain forms of knowledge are not given to people when they're young, that you receive them at a later age when one is spiritually developed or one can receive those. And this knowledge that Musa alayhi salam was receiving, by the way, this is a very important point. It's very possible that we have very little knowledge of what Musa alayhi salam actually received during this journey. God only mentions a few things. It's very possible that many other things took place during this journey that we'll never know about. And God only mentioned a few things that are of benefit to us and remove the rest of the journey, because the journey seems to be quite long. They get on a boat, they travel to one place, then they travel to another place. Some say the journey took months, some say the journey took up to a year. Who knows? Now, this point I want to mention, and I want to emphasize as the idea of the young, as for young people, or younger people. Well, I assume we'll consider ourselves to be young. Is the idea that knowledge is given, especially in terms of our legal, our law, but especially spiritual knowledge, is not an open. It requires a tarbiyah. It requires tarbiyah, and it requires a tajriba. It requires a nurturing and a training, and it requires a tajriba, which is experience. So therefore, young people at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 are not experienced enough often to understand subtleties of life in any way or form. And that's why we have, for instance, right now, these young imams qualifying from madrasas, etc., and coming out and beginning to preach and things of that nature when it's not their remit at all, and then falling very quickly, and then all the community pointing their fingers at them, saying, look at these imams, how they're behaving. The reality is that they were not spiritually mature enough to be in a position to tell other people what to do. These are ideas of tarbiyah. I'll give you an example. I remember I was in my 20s, and there was a young imam who I had heard at the age of 19, he was taking spiritual disciples. I heard it at first. I was like, okay, that's a bit odd. Not only is that odd, but it is completely, I don't know what kind of adjective I can use, a word I can use to describe it. But it's, anyway, of course, he fell, and, it was quite clear that he hadn't even experienced the basics of life, leave alone of guiding people. But it seems clear that we have, for instance, a tradition in Damascus of scholars being considered scholars after the age of 40, meaning after they mature in that sense. And also in the subcontinent, the word Maulvi was given to somebody after the age of 40, after they've been become accomplished spiritually. I mean, they've grown up and gone through life struggles and things of that nature. But on the spiritual journey, age is incredibly important. And that's why in our history, you find very few, in hardly any, you have the exceptions, of young spiritual masters. You don't really find them. You find young people who are spiritual, who are on a spiritual journey, but not masters giving tarbiyah. It comes very late, and in indication this surah is quite clear that Yusha bin Nun is not taken on this journey. This journey is only between al-Khadir, this multi-dimensional figure in the Quran, this saintly figure of the Quran, and Musa alayhi salam. Now I want to talk about one more verse, inshallah, and then we're going to stop there for this week, and we're going to talk about the themes, maybe up to 10 themes next week, and break them down. I want to talk about the next verse. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَجْمَعَ بَيْنِهِمَا نَسِيَ حُوتَهُمَا فَاتَّخَذَ سَبِيلَهُ فِي الْبَحْرِ سَرَبًا. I want to talk about this idea of miraculous occurrences, although that's not our topic. Miracles are not our topic. We can dedicate, inshallah, a discourse to miracles and the argument of, are there such things as miracles? If they are, how do we explain them? How do we see miracles? When miracles seemingly are khariqul adat, the super-rational occurrences, and if God has set a law, why would God then interject and arbitrarily break those laws? And what's the point of miracles if they do? If miracles are as we think they are? That's another discourse altogether, and it will take a long time to unpack that. It will take a lot of discussion of what that may be. And I know it's a topic of controversy as well, but I'm more than willing to discuss it and my take on it, inshallah. And by the way, Christians have also been discussing these things. And for instance, John Lennox has a whole lecture on this and a short book you can read on it as well. And they've written some excellent works on this as well, topic of idea of miracles and what purpose miracles serve. But anyway, this part of the story states in the Quran, when they reached the junction of the two seas, they forgot their fish, and it took its way amazingly through the sea, as in an underground channel. Now, there are several lessons to remember here, of course, but the greatest lesson that we can see here is the fact that something out of this world occurs. Signs of God. A sign of God appears, and it seemingly is a sign of God that infers that they've reached they've reached their place. Now, the subtlety, according to some of the spiritual commentaries on this, is that when one, because it states فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ, when they reach that place, that when one reaches a particular position in their spiritual journey, then with it God will send a sign, something quite clear to them, that infers that they have reached a particular place for them to continue their journey onto something else. Again, it would require a murabbi, a spiritual master, that could point that out, that okay, you have reached a particular stage, and that stage now requires you to move on to the next stage, this idea of tadrij. However, I want to talk about, and I'll finish on this point inshallah before I take questions for today, is this point of forgetfulness. Now, in this verse, Nisyan is mentioned. I want to just introduce the topic today. It states that he, Yusha bin Nun, فَلَمَّا جَاوَزَ قَالَ لِفَتَاهُ آتِنَا غَدَاءَنَا لَقَدْ لَقِينَا مِنْ سَفْرَ هَذَا نَصَبًا. And then Yusha bin Nun, after Moses asks for his lunch, says, look, something happened, I forgot to mention it to you. The idea of forgetfulness, forgetting things, is unbelievably a central part of our spiritual nature. In fact, insan, the word insan according to many, is from the verb nasiya in Arabic, to forget. And it's sometimes related to, in spiritual significance, related to the covenant, the ahad and the mithaq that we forgot, that we have forgotten, that we made with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mentioned this last week in the discourse. We have forgotten that we made with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we have to overcome on the spiritual journey what we have forgotten. That on the spiritual journey one begins to unlock that which has become absent from their mind, and begins to remember things related to the ahad and the mithaq. And inshallah, I'm going to start from that next week, and we'll begin with the concept of forgetfulness, and then we're going to move on to 3 or 4 main concepts: tarbiyah, suhba, ishq, and hub, and a few others that are mentioned in the story, and spiritual masters and how they took from this story and applied it to the life of a person who aspires to be a spiritually enlightened person. So we'll do that next week. Another point as well, there was a request that the discourses videos were all named discourses on the YouTube channel. I've changed that. I've named them appropriately of what their titles were today. So if you want to recap and go check those out, please. They're all put in order now, and you can watch over those previous discourses that we had. So we'll stop there for questions now, inshallah. And this chapter or this topic will continue next week. Hamza, if you can bring in any questions that you have as well. Can you please provide reading material for this matter? What matter is that? Sorry. There were loads of matters and that. So if somebody can clarify what they mean. To what degree can we balance seeking out spiritual development with gaining experience? So, the very good, excellent question. This is something that obviously I've thought about quite a bit, and for myself as a kind of test case or case study, in the sense that, and for yourself as well, if you use your own examples. Experience is probably. I'll start with a quote from Confucius. Confucius said that wisdom, which is the lost property of the believer, of course, wherever you find it, it's fine. Said that wisdom is gained in 3 ways: either by imitation. You see somebody, you see people, wise people around you, and you take from them. You absorb whatever you see. And he said that's the easiest imitation. By reflection, that's the most difficult. Or by experience, and that is the most bitter, he said. Meaning the greatest spiritual lessons seem to be those of experience, and experience teaches us like nothing else. Experience is part of, I don't know if you've watched, has anybody watched the Yunus Emre program? The Turks have done an excellent rendition of that story. Yunus Emre, who was a student, he was a Qadi originally, he was a student of Tabtuk Emre, who was a contemporary of Rumi, by the way. And no, Yunus Emre was a contemporary of Rumi. I think Tabtuk was probably slightly before. So in that, Yunus Emre begins as a Qadi sent to a place. He's a scholar, he's a judge. And he meets this old man, the sheikh. He doesn't know he's a spiritual man, or he doesn't know anything about him. He meets him and he's drawn towards him. And he's stuck in his ways. Yunus Emre, as a scholar, he's trapped by those limits. And he keeps meeting this old man, and this old man just keeps popping up in his life. And eventually he becomes his student, but he finds it very difficult because he still has the baggage of study and arrogance. And so this sheikh then spends years, putting him through that ordeal. And he finds it really difficult. And, he leaves and comes back and leaves and comes back to break his nafs and things like that. So, and he shows you all the experiences that he has. And obviously the point I'm making is that people learn through their experiences. If you were to weigh up all the experiences, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones that you've had, if you were to be asked that, do you wish you never had them? Many people will say, no, actually, I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't have those experiences. I wouldn't be the person I am today. And similarly, spiritually, that's why the people of God, if you look at historically, people of God are the ones that take the most kind of the difficulties on their shoulders. They have very difficult lives. That's how they become like that. They become like that because gold is tested with fire. And Sayyidina Ali said, and the believer is tested with ibtila, meaning difficulties. So experience really conditions us to be great people. So experience is incredibly important. I would say is centrally one of the most important things for any spiritual journey is experience. And that's why we don't have this tradition of somebody just running away and just sitting in a cave, only in a cave, never coming out, and then coming back and now he's a spiritual person. In fact, people who did escape to solitude, which is a part of it, although it's categorically stated by Imam al-Kushairi, I think Imam al-Kushairi, that solitude is not for the novice. In fact, solitude will destroy the novice. The novice on the spiritual path cannot be in solitude, because why? He'll have only the devil with him. Only the trained person, solitude is for him. But anyway, we don't have that tradition. The spiritual masters grew up with people and around people, and everybody experienced their kind of great spirituality. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope to a degree of balance seeking spiritual development. So I would say spiritual development comes through or from our experiences in life. A large part of it comes through our experiences in life. Like somebody who may not feel ready to become married. No, but you can't. Marriage is different, isn't it? Like you can't experience marriage before marriage. Well, you can if you're divorced, but like you can't have a test run for marriage. Marriage is one of those. It's got to jump in and get married. And unfortunately, marriage, I don't know. You can't be like it's not. Marriage is not one of those things that fits into it. I don't think marriage. You just got to take that. People obsess over this marriage. Or maybe I should probably answer this. Stop obsessing. People become so obsessed with so many particulars when it comes to marriage that they never end up getting married. Because they're so anxious about so many different. Even parents often, oh, but what if he's not like this or she's not like this and not perfect? Or marriage is once the certain things line up, then you just get married. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Qadrullah maqdura. You can think everything's perfect and it won't work out, and you can think only 20% is right and the marriage will be perfect. So you'll never get over. You'll never be able to answer those anxieties through istikhara or anything like that. People do istikhara wrong anyway. Idea of marriage is not. You don't make istikhara like that for marriage. Marriage, you just seek out the person's qualities, look at the family, etc. If they all match up, get married. If it doesn't work out, qadrullah, it's just the way it is. So yeah, I'll repeat the quote. Let me just take some of these other questions. In terms of the discussion of Sayyidina Khadir, do those who believe he is alive believe he will eventually taste death to align with every soul? Yes, they do. In Nawawi, actually, check this out. Believed, as far as I'm aware, I have to check this, but believe that he will fight against Dajjal. That in the hadith of Dajjal, the man that he apparently kills and brings back alive, and the young man who says, "My Lord is not one-eyed," is al-Khadir, which is another interesting idea. Like I said, these are not. Don't take these to be kind of rational arguments or discussions. When Khadir comes into play, it does seem this like multi-dimensional kind of. It's kind of this. The discussion is multi-dimensional. It has to be. We have to open that discussion up. Although that's not the topic entirely today. Is there narration regarding Khadir in the army of Dhul-Qarnayn finding the Fount of Youth? Okay, very good question. So a few years ago, I did do quite a bit of. Let me grab it for you actually. I did quite a bit of reading on the Khadir issue, and I lost a book as well. If anybody's got my book on Khadir, please return it to me, the Arabic book. I think I lost it somewhere, and I've never found it again. And anyway, so there's an author. His name is Muhammad Khair Ramadan Yusuf. He authored this book as well, which is around 500 to 600 pages. He authored two important works. One is on al-Khadir, and the other one is on Dhul-Qarnayn. And in Arabic, they're both in Arabic. And very excellent works. I love them, to be honest with you, although the one on Dhul-Qarnayn is pretty long. But he mentions those riwayat, and I haven't got time to really discuss it in detail. There are a multitude of fabrications. For instance, Alexander Romance, Iskandar Nama in Persian, which is a complete fabrication which alludes to the idea that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander. They mention all this idea that Alexander sends, or Dhul-Qarnayn, in their belief, if you to argue that he's Alexander, which he wasn't clearly, sends him to find the Fountain of Youth, and he finds it, but Dhul-Qarnayn dies before he gets there, and he's going to protect it till the Day of Judgment. So, what's called Ainul Hayat. Now that's another interesting discussion, which obviously we haven't got really time for. And I have a detailed seminar about this, by the way, called People of the Unseen. But that's all interesting. But a lot of it seems to be false. It seems to be the kind of stories, made up stories and fables and things like that. It's very difficult to differentiate. But there are a lot of narrations, though, that although weak, may have certain inferences about the Dhul-Qarnayn and the al-Khadir story. But so that will take some time too. So, but you're right, there are some narrations like that. I don't know if that answers you. Hopefully that answers you. Because there are some things there, but I don't believe they have any strength, really. First cousin marriages. Is that a question, or is that you should put no after that. But shouldn't be the norm. I said about this, so Sayyidina Ali's quote is that fire is tested with, gold is tested with fire, and human beings are tested with trials, tests. Yeah, that's the quote. Abu al-Harith al-Muhasibi mentions it in his introduction to his famous book, Risalatul Mustarshidin. What is the title of the Arabic book on Khadir? It's called, you can't get a PDF of it. I bought it in Damascus. It's called, I think, al-Khadir Bain I can't remember the full title. It's called al-Khadir and then Bain something between myth and fact or something like that. I can't remember the exact Arabic though. I read it multiple times. It's a brilliant book actually. So you can get that work if you can get hold of it. I think Nilwal Furat, if you follow, I think they have it. Hamza, check that out. If they have it, get me a copy as well. Because I've lost mine. So you mentioned that other traditions that talk of al-Khadir, where can we find more? That's the book. Yeah, that's the book. It's a very easy read for those people who have even decent Arabic. They'll be able to read it. He has a detailed commentary on Surah Al-Kahf story as well, of Khadir and Musa. Yeah. So do we have any other questions before we depart today? So. Khair, shukran lakum. Allah reward you. So next week we'll be back continuing with this. And I wanted this to be more of it because I had a lot to say. And I've got even more. Hopefully just one more dars on this and then discourse on this and then maybe 3 weeks. But I don't want to stretch it to 3 weeks. How skeptical should we be, if at all, when reading such stories? Skeptical about what exactly? What parts of the story should we be, if you could... if you can add to that. Someone's asking, how skeptical should we be, if at all, when reading such stories? So are you talking about the story itself? Are you talking about some of the details that I gave? Oh, okay. You mean people who met al-Khadir, I assume, yeah? Okay, not from Quran, so no good. So my general principle is that if it's in Al-Quran Al-Kareem, is we believe it. That requires belief, yani wajib al-i'tiqad. If in hadith, we have to look at the daraja of the hadith. And, if the hadith is gharib, if it's khabr al-ahad, if the hadith is da'if, hadith mawdu'. And generally speaking, as far as I'm aware, there are almost very few hadith that are even sound in relation to al-Khadir. In terms of stories now, al-qisas, should we be skeptical? Well, number one, there's no way of believing in them because, no way of not believing, no way of confirming those stories, yeah, that they actually happen. Because remember, what we have often is hundreds of years between us and even the author. So we can't even sometimes validate if the author even said that. For instance, Abdul Qadir al-Jili, rahimullah ta'ala, Abdul Qadir Gilani, rahimullah ta'ala, that there are miracles that Sheikh Abul Fatah Ghudda, for instance, mentioned this clearly as well, rahimullah, that how many miracles do you know of Abdul Qadir al-Gilani? And so many, and many of them are fabricated. Many of them are fabricated. Subcontinent, the amount of stuff they make up, these public speakers, is unbelievable. It never happened, these things, and they're just making them up as it makes a sound. The funny one about that, I don't know, mention it today, but so as for now, however, what if you've got somebody and there's a degree of soundness of a narration that goes back to author X, whoever it may be, and he says, I met al-Khadir, or he thinks he met al-Khadir, but that's what he claims. Then you have to ask yourself, well, there are a few possibilities here. Either he imagined it, it was a dream maybe, or either he met somebody that he thought was Khadir and he misinterpreted it. Or he met somebody who claimed it was Khadir that wasn't Khadir. All of these things are possible. Now, the fact that all these things are possible, it'd be very difficult to say it actually happened and we absolutely believe in the fact that it actually happened. Because people have misinterpreted things historically, of course, and, misunderstood and stuff like that. It's very possible, I'm not saying. However, with the Khadir problem, and I'll call it the problem in a sense that historically there's an overwhelming number of these reports where you have so many people claiming the same thing. When that happens, for me anyway, I'm thinking to myself, there's not that belief. You don't need to believe it. You can be skeptical and say, I don't believe in any of it. Perfectly fine, no problem. Absolutely no problem in that. However, people criticize me for that and say, oh, how can you say that? Well, if you can't validate something, you can't prove it to somebody, you merely have stories, you can't expect a person to believe if that person has a skeptical mind to begin with. It's very difficult. Don't burden people with these types of things. However, when there's not a causality, but a correlation at least, when you have all these stories kind of in saying the same thing, you think to yourself, is there something here? And certain people that will swing them that way. I'll give you an example. You may be familiar with NDEs, near-death experiences. It's almost unanimous now that near-death experiences are a real thing. Thousands of people in this era and historically have had near-death experiences that many of them, although it's anecdotal, have almost identical experiences, these out-of-body experiences, to the degree that many expert scientists, that is neurologists especially, are giving weight to this idea now and saying, look, we can't just absolutely deny it here. So my point is here that when many people are saying almost exactly the same thing, it's interesting, at the least we have to accept, even if you're a skeptical person, that there may be some basis for this. If you want to believe it or not, that's up to you. Nobody's obligating that. هذا ليس من ضروريات الدين يعني. It's not part of faith. But, you know, there's something there. I mean, and I'm being balanced here. I'm not giving you my own opinion. That I'll keep to myself. But I'm saying that many people have narrated these types of experiences, definitely. So yeah, hopefully that opens that up a little bit for you. But I just added that dimension anyway. There's no harm in that. Yeah, okay. Should we finish off here? I've gone over a little bit. Yeah. Okay, Khair. I'll finish here. Sorry for the delay. You know, I was quite worried my camera just stopped working, and then I was sweating away trying to get it. And then I updated the software and it works. Alhamdulillah. I'll see everybody next week, 8 o'clock. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.